You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast with myself, Mike Klein, and Brian Wood, and today we are joined by Brent and Regina Beidler from Randolph Center, Vermont. They are organic dairy farmers, and I just want to thank you two for being with us. And Brent, can you give us a little bit of an introduction to your farm?
Yeah, thanks for having us, Mike and Brian. It's our farm is right in the center of the state of Vermont, and we're in in the hills. We have a 145-acre farm, and 100 acres is open, and then we rent a little bit of our neighboring land too. And we have a herd of 40 cows, and we do a few diversification. So on our farm, we produce small grains that we mill into flour for the local market on a very small scale. And we also grow flowers for cut flowers for our neighbors, and sell a little bit of that locally too. So we have been organic for most of the 20 years that we have been on this farm.
And was this a home farm for you, or did you guys did you grow up? Did both of you grow up on a farm, or is this was this a passion that all of a sudden an opportunity came up and you took it?
Yeah, I'll speak briefly to that, and I'll let Regina jump in. We for both of us, it skipped a generation. We both had grandfathers who had farms in Pennsylvania, and so we grew up visiting our grandfather's farms, and I like to say that's where I was inoculated to the desire to farm, because I kind of would visit even as a little boy. Our family trips down usually involved starting out early in the morning, and my mom was always fearful that if she told me ahead of time that I was going to Grandpa's farm, that I wouldn't be able to sleep because I was so excited. So they learned that they would keep it secret, and they just wake me up in the morning before we went. And I was just, it was the most wonderful place in the world for me, because, the cows, the watching my aunts and uncles working with the cows. They had 12 children, 13 children actually. My mom was the 13th, and so they there was so much activity on the farm that I quickly fell in love with the whole lifestyle. And I think remembering the first time that I was in the barn with my uncles milking, and they were talking about the cows and who. Their unique attributes, and who was ridiculous, and who was a kicker, and who was their favorites, and I said, boy, that's really neat. And and Regina had kind of the same experience, and I'll let her talk a little bit about what it was like her growing up and being the next a generation back.
Yeah, I'll say we also spent our summer vacations going to my grandparents' farm. My grandparents had a beef, tobacco, and crop farm, so it was a little bit different as far as the daily routine.
Also in Pennsylvania?
In Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So our parents originally came from Pennsylvania. Both of our families moved to Vermont doing alternative service to serving in the military. We came from Mennonite background, so as conscientious objectors, they were classified as 1Ws, so they served alternative service. And in both of our cases, our families decided to stay in Vermont. So Brent and I were both born there, but have deep roots in other communities around the country. So we would also go to the farm, and I just remember just being struck. Our parents would go away to work, so we didn't have a clear vision of what they did. But when you're on the farm, you know what people do for their work. You get to go along, you get to ride on the tractor, you get to sit up on the hay bales while other people do the hard work of stacking. You get to go out and collect the eggs. It was magical. When you're a kid, it's a magical place to be, so that was a really fun thing. I did not have the same ambitions that Brent did. The story that he didn't tell was that his grandfather used to try to get his teenage uncles up for milking in the morning, which was almost impossible. But Brent would be down the stairs right on the heels of his grandfather, who declared that this kid could be a farmer because he knows how to get up in the morning. So from what I understand, that was the impetus for thinking you could
absolutely,
be a farmer.
Yeah. And, as a young kid, just hearing that you're going to be something other than a kid was fascinating enough. But to hear your grandfather proclaim you as a farmer, that made a big impression on me. And after that time, I sought out mentors of other people that were closer to where I lived in Vermont, other farmers that were willing to let me plod along behind them and show me how they farmed and let me be involved. So,
So you got married and lived in Vermont and were not farmers, correct?
Well, we had a little bit of a circuitous route to get there. Brent was a few years older than I was, and so after high school, he went in one direction, went to college for a year, and then had 3 years where he was working for farmers, just trying to figure out the direction he wanted to go, and then finished his animal science degree at University of Vermont. And I was in Virginia for college, lived in Boston for 4 years. Brent actually served with an organization called Mennonite Central Committee as an agricultural volunteer in Bangladesh for 3 years. So it took a while for us to come back and be physically in the same location. But we did, and got married at that point. But Brent was 30 when we got married, so a little later than some people get married. So our route to having our own farm was a little bit delayed just because we had other things that we did first.
Yeah, and then at the time we were married, we were growing vegetables. I was growing vegetables as my hoping to get into farming, but very discouraged with the dairy farming possibility because at that time farms were selling out, and the conventional market didn't seem to have much to offer us as far as stability and the pricing. And but when the organic milk market came to Vermont, we decided that that looks like a possibility. There's a dedication to a sustained fair price to the farmers, and that's when we decided, we can maybe make a go of this. And so we realized our dream. In between, we also went to Africa together with the same organization, Mennonite Central Committee, deciding that before we settled down to the purchasing of a farm where you pretty much a mortgage is where you're at, that we would do some voluntary service because we felt that was important for us. And so when we came back, then we found a farm that we could purchase, and that's where we've been. And our daughter came along the same year that we purchased the farm. Our daughter Erin was born, and so we started off farming with her, and it was all about really that would be the place where we raise our child, and now that she's 20 years old, it seems like that really was a good decision for us. It's turned out to be what we hoped it would be as far as a good place to raise a family.
And the striking thing, I think, from the time between, we had that long gap between college and then through some service terms and working for other farmers before we purchased our farm, was the generosity of a large number of farmers in sharing both technical information. They shared their production figures so that we could know if we were realistically planning for the number of cows and what it would cost and what our expenses would be. And when we were looking for a farm, we had people actively working on our behalf to try to help us find a good farm. So I think there's a lot to be said for that type of help and mentoring that we had along the way, and what kind of impact that has on young farmers, especially who are trying to get started.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you ship conventional milk for a couple years or a while before you went organic?
Yeah, we did ship. Our farm needed to be transitioned to organic production. It took 3 years, and so for the first years that we were shipping milk, we were in the conventional market, and we were receiving $11 per hundredweight for our milk that year, and that was the price that my grandfather had back in the 70s. So it just does show that the market was difficult for us getting started in. And
unfortunately, that's close to the price where we're at today.
Yeah, so painful to watch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that was 20 years ago almost now. And you mentioned you saw organic as an option. Now, 20 years ago, that was kind of a out there idea, I guess. I wasn't around then, but it's grown a lot in the years since. So how did that opportunity even present itself? Was there community members that were already shipping, or how did that look?
Yeah, let me back up just a little bit and say that I got excited about grazing earlier when I was watching how other farms operated. I had an uncle who had started grazing his cows and had been seeing that it was working for him, health benefits. And I like to say that, grazing for many of the organic farms is kind of our gateway drug. That's how we got started. First realizing that rotational grazing where, resting pastures in between, managed grazes, that you can have not only better production, but there's health benefits for your soils and your profitability. And so that's where it was with that getting excited about grazing started to open up the way that I thought about farming. I would say using the left brain a little bit. When you graze your pastures, you have to go out and see how the grasses are regrowing and manage according to, it's a little bit art and science, rotational grazing. And so by starting down that path of already hoping to have a grazing farm, it led us to the possibility then of looking at organic, which is, as you said, a little bit of a way out there, concept of farming at that time, because it wasn't as nearly as well known as it is now.
You also had a really good mentor and a professor at University of Vermont named Bill Murphy, who was a real zealot for management-intensive grazing. And Brent was one of his skeptical students, if we're doing full disclosure at first. Not sure if that, if it made sense, but you said that you worked for a farm that he actually grazed the heifers for that farm, and what left in one trailer came back in two. So if you look at the power of grazing for young animals like that, it made a big impact.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, while I was at the University of Vermont studying, I was working on a farm for my room and board, and watched him trying things out and seeing the power of management intensive grazing. That's what won me over. And at that same time, there was a real outreach program amongst the farm community for farmers that wanted to graze, and it was farmers supporting each other in what they were learning. There wasn't as much information yet about the technique, and so farmers were actually sharing. There was discussion groups where they would share amongst each other how it was going, and had what we call pasture walks where you could go onto different farms. And so that was really a real foundational part of us developing the way that we wanted to farm. I saw farmers that were excited about their what's happening on their farms, and that enthusiasm and optimism and was, to me, infectious.
Mm-hmm. Also made sense to us financially. We had grandparents who farmed, but we weren't farming at their properties. So to purchase a farm, the cows and all of the needed equipment and pieces that you usually do is a huge amount of money. So by having a grass-based or a grazing-based farm, we really minimized how much equipment we purchased at first. We were very shoestring for a number of years.
Were you seasonal?
For a couple years early on, we were, but we aren't anymore. But at the time, I think early on it was challenging because we had old equipment that would break at inopportune moments that needed to be repaired. So budgeting correctly for seasonal was challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting when you look at the grazing movement back in the 90s, basically when it really took off, and how that led so many farmers down the path of going organic.
Completely.
Yes.
Because all of a sudden they saw what it's doing to the soil, they saw what it's doing to the cows and the health benefits, and it just, I think that's the greatest thing about organic dairy is you have to graze.
Yes.
And having those cows out on pasture, usually it's April, usually in Ohio, cows are on pasture now, and
it's May in Vermont,
right
Mike. Is it May? Yes, we're a little behind. Yeah.
It's interesting, though, because in every community as organic comes in, there's a certain learning curve for the neighborhood, too. When we purchased our farm in the late 90s, we immediately fenced everything, and the people who had owned it before were our neighbors, geographical neighbors. They thought we were, ruining perfectly good corn ground by planting it to grass and putting a fence around it. So the idea that grazing is actually the crop you want to maximize and really get the most profit from was very foreign. It's you do the rocky hillsides that you can't put a tractor on. That's what people would traditionally graze. So even the mindset around that this could be a really good way and a profitable way to farm was a bit of a challenge in the neighborhood at first.
Yeah.
So were you some of the first group of farmers to go organic? And then the follow-up question would be, have you seen the people that were your neighbors or still are your neighbors see the benefits and follow the lead, essentially?
Yeah, there was an early group of people like Jack Laser in Vermont who were early organic dairy farmers, not necessarily connected to a cooperative, but doing their own value-added product, who had pioneered quite a bit. But we were amongst, I would say, somewhat of the early people who took organic dairy in the state.
Yeah. We were the first truckload for Organic Valley when they came in to Vermont. They had started in Wisconsin, and then
that was 98.
Yes.
And, 99 was the meeting
Okay.
For Vermont.
Yes.
So it was just after that time. Our timing was really serendipitous when you look at when we started. That when we finished our transition, it worked out nicely that we had a market that was ready for our milk.
And that was that the first load of milk for Organic Valley outside of Wisconsin? No. Or were they
Maine.
West Coast?
Maine was in 1997.
Oh, Maine
Yep.
was before.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And it was to provide milk for Stonyfield yogurt, and then Vermont came along.
And I think Oregon was about the same time as
Yep.
Vermont as well. So yeah, it was just as that market was starting to expand.
Yeah. So we were not necessarily pioneers. We were we helped move some stumps as far as the organic farmers getting started. When Regina and I were growing up, there was 5,000 dairy farms in the state of Vermont. And then by the time we were starting, there was 1,800. So they'd already lost, by the time I was 35.
Wow.
And in the time that we've been farming this last 20 years, we're down to 740
40, I think.
or 50,
740.
in the state. So dramatic
It's precipitous
reduction.
drops.
But the amount there's over 250, I think, Vermont organic farms in Vermont. So it has been a lifeline for a lot of the smaller farms. They have been able to find a place in the organic market. So that's over 25%, and so that's
Well, that
a
has to be
significant
the
shift.
highest percentage in any state, isn't it?
I mean, it would be curious to compare. I know I've heard some people talk about Wisconsin saving big losses. And one of our friends from North Carolina was talking about, he lives in the largest dairy county in North Carolina. 2 years ago, they had 52 farms. The end of last year, they had 30, and he thinks they'll be under 20 by the end of this year. So I just think it shows sort of the dynamics in the conventional milk marketplace and how dire things are right now.
Mm-hmm. But it is fun to watch a community like you were 20 years ago, and we see it with working in Ohio for Mike and working in Indiana and Michigan, is you get some people that are willing to think outside the box, and they learn from some of the others that are, like you said, you weren't necessarily pioneers, but you certainly moved some stumps. But being successful and having other people watch you do that, and then they follow and learn, and then you wind up all learning from each other, and it's this whole community aspect, and it just is it's a fun thing to see. It's a fun thing to see. It really is.
And you hear the stories again and again. We had one neighbor who is now an organic farmer for quite a long time too, but he'd say, Brent got a new tractor. So, it's those kind of indications that things must be going okay if you're replacing equipment, if the farm's looking a little bit more spruced up. It's very visual. And I think for a lot of people just watching grazing, we have a lot of road frontage at our farm. So a lot of people were watching very carefully what we were doing and how the cows were looking. And so I think a lot of that really contributed. The other thing that we really appreciated over the years, we had a local we called it a pasture group or a discussion group that would meet monthly. And we got to the point where we started pulling out our books, and they would say, wow, you spent a lot this year on repairing equipment. So maybe you should be purchasing a new tractor, or they could help see things or give advice around shared discussions. And I think there's some real value. It's very vulnerable to share figures, but there's a lot of wisdom when you have people's advice along with your own, what you should be doing.
But I think having that support group, and right now in Ohio, there's half a dozen farmers that want to start this small group where they go on each other's farms and they point out things that they think they should change and do better. Keep it to a small group, and then the goal is to try this pilot program for a year. Then maybe these 6 farmers are from kind of scattered all over, so maybe each farmer can start their own little group, because the support system that is in place with organics is phenomenal.
Yes.
And I think we can just keep expanding that. And for, when you guys started out, without that support of other farmers, you probably wouldn't have survived. And I think that is so key, is to be there to help. And, just because somebody does something a little bit weird, you're like, what's he doing? But to help learn and understand is so key.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's empowering too, because then, you're not getting all your information just from a salesman person or from an expert at a university. You're getting it from each other and from yourself, and you're able to make decisions based on what you're seeing every day as you walk your pastures and live with your cows.
And I think farmer decision making just is inherently different. We worked with a person who works for Extension in our state of Vermont. She said the most important question to ask farmers after they try something is, would you do it again? Because it doesn't matter if it was profitable or how much it cost, but if they wouldn't do it again, then it probably is not worth continuing.
Yeah,
to
there's a
pursue
certain
it.
filter that has to go through.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that when you bring a speaker in to talk to farmers, the person who is paying their bills by farming carries a lot more weight than a professional with all the answers but is not doing it.
Absolutely.
And it's the being able to relate to a farmer because you are doing it is where I think there is incredible value.
Yes.
Because a farmer, if something works, I see that if a farmer tries something and it works, he will tell everybody. Okay? If it doesn't work, he will tell at least the people closest to him. Maybe not everybody that he failed at it, but the sharing of information is so great to see.
Yeah, I agree, and the network that is formed, in Organic Valley too, or some of the networks where people are able to reach out in an organized way that doesn't necessarily exist otherwise.
I agree, and I think part of it in the grazing and organic movement, it was based on you were almost forced to make that community and share with each other because there was not the support. I mean, you did mention that at University of Vermont you had somebody a professor you worked with, but even today you still look and that system is not in place like it is for conventional row cropping or whatever it may be. Yeah. That is very highly supported in the university system, and they have experts that do all the minuscule testing and scientific research, and that's not there on the organic side. And in some ways that's not a bad thing, because it, like we've been talking, it forces that community to grow of farmers sharing what works and what doesn't, and maybe even finally getting to the point where you're willing to share numbers and say, hey, look at you make yourself very vulnerable, but you also open it up to really improving management. I mean, in the end, and improving profitability and improving your lifestyle in the end. It's a fun thing to be a part of.
Yeah.
I think it makes farmers into critical thinkers too when you don't just automatically accept the advice of everybody. Mm-hmm. You think, well, does that make sense to me based on what I know and what I've heard from other people who are doing it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the pleasures that we've had as a family too is there are other farmers that were kind of coming along just a little behind us that were asking us questions as we went along, thinking about making transitions to either grazing or to organic. Their kids are now getting into farming. It's a possibility for them, and we get to meet their children. Sometimes I'm thinking of a couple families that what a pleasure to know that they've when we meet their kids as they're talking with us, they have optimism, and they've grown up within an organic crop farming system. Many of them don't even know how to give an injection because that's not something that they ever grew up seeing.
Mm-hmm. I think seeing opportunity is widespread across the country too, Mike. I know I've heard your dad talk about in your area that as people saw the opportunity of organic, that kids are kind of coming back to the farm. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really good thing everywhere.
I think that for me is the most exciting thing is kids that might have grown up as when they were younger, they did not ever want to be a farmer because there was absolutely no money there. Mm-hmm. Then all of a sudden now they're seeing that, oh, you can be a farmer and actually make money and have the perfect place to raise a family.
Yeah.
I don't have a farm, but I still think there's no better place to raise kids than on a farm. I just don't see. I tried to emulate things that I learned growing up on a farm, and you can't. If you don't have a farm, you can't emulate a farm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think seeing the next generations being excited about farming is what gets me excited. Mm-hmm. It's not the person in the family that didn't get a degree and didn't get a good job that's farming anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for too long, that was kind of the mindset. I know in Holmes County among the Amish, there was the mindset that the one with the least skill would stay at home and take over the family farm.
Yeah.
And that has significantly changed. It has also changed because land's $30,000 an acre. So everybody has a vested interest in the farm. But I think it's so exciting to hear, like in Vermont, which is completely different than my area, but to see that you were on the front end of giving the next generation a chance at farming and being successful. That's something to be really proud of.
Yeah.
And I think an appreciation just from the general public too about the value of farming. Your story reminds me of one that I told about my father. Years ago, he was asked to present to an elder hostel group who came to Vermont to explain how Mennonites had arrived in Vermont. So as he was presenting, he was talking about a lot of them had worked in hospitals, and so somebody said, "Well, is that the background that most of you came from, that you were trained to be medical people?" And he said, "Oh no, we were just farmers." And I stopped him. I said, "What do you mean you were just farmers?" Because it's that same kind of thing, like, well, if you can't do anything else, then you should farm, without really the appreciation for the skill set and the kind of level of complexity that has to be managed when you're running a farm.
Yeah.
So I've never let him forget it, but I'm sure he didn't mean it intentionally, unkindly.
Yeah. And, our daughter is so glad that she was raised on a farm. She's not interested in farming. She's got other ideas, and that's so good. I'm so happy with that, because farming was my dream, and so she can have her dream. But she mentioned, she spent the first years of her life in a backpack, following us around on the farm. She learned all the cows' names by the time she was 3 years old, because she was spending time with us and hearing us say their names and being so much of a part of it. So even now that she's not interested in being, farming herself, she has a deep appreciation not only for the food system, but I think the love and appreciation for the way of life that she grew up with. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And a value system that was taught on the farm too, of hard work, and that will carry over no matter where she goes, whether it's on a farm or somewhere else. I see that over and over again, whether you're on the farm, but if you grew up on a farm, you learn the value of hard work, and it carries over for a lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think the value of knowing that people name their cows,
Yeah.
it's not cow 48. And there's a lot of great farmers that take care of their animals with just name tags or numbers. But we always had cow families, the first letter. Okay, if it was Jewel or whatever, then that heifer calf would start with a J and it would go down the line. So you have the alphabet.
Yeah.
And I wish there was a way to show consumers, like when you name the cow, that is almost a family member.
Yeah.
And it is in your best interest to treat that cow like a family member, because that is your source of income. And when you do that as a child, you realize how important it is to take care of your animals up through. And I think it's wonderful. And I love hearing that you named your cows.
Yeah, and we have the same system, actually. Every cow family has a letter, so for example, Daphne, we'd have to name her calf something that starts with D, and every year we have a theme. So we have different. This year we're on the.
We're giving journalists a thumbs up.
Yes, because
they're having
taken
such a
it
hard ride
in the media. So we're naming them after. So I had one born just the other day too. We're naming her after Gwen Eiffel, so she's Gwen, and but that's the way we do. That way we can connect the families, and it's fun. We talk about it together. When I have a calf born, I'll poll the girls to see, what should we name this one,
And that was something that, as far as child involvement too, over the years, you can see the times where Erin influenced. We had a Harry Potter year. We had a cartoon. We had a desserts year. So
we had the celebrity train wreck year.
That's
yeah.
Right. So yeah, it's just, but you see the personalities and very distinct.
And what's neat is now you can go back and look at these cows, and that'll jog the memory of why they were named. Like we had a candy bar year.
Yeah. Oh, good one.
All kinds of candy bars.
Yeah.
But then the next year was something completely different. And we never did year by year. It was just whatever my sisters basically felt like doing.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I think that's so neat, because now you can go back, and when you hear that cow's name, it'll take you right back to, oh, that was such and such theme year.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah.
cool.
No,
It's interesting when you get a number of farm families together, like, and you share your farm stories. There's so much interesting stuff that comes out, and a lot of it's about the animals. Pigs in particular always generate lots of good family stories. The stuff they do, the ridiculous things that happen, and that's, to me, is one of the big joys of farming. Is what the family shares in your collective history that which includes your animal family history too. It grows together.
Is there anything that teaches a child more responsibility than actually taking care of animals?
It's really kind of hard to imagine, and the realities of life too, because not every animal that gets sick gets well, but most, but there's that, deep appreciation for how you're responsible each and every day. And if you shirk your responsibility, that animal may suffer for it. And so children learn that investing and doing what you need to do for your animals is a reality, and it really does teach lessons for the rest of your life, I think.
I think the modeling too, kids learn a lot from watching their parents. So I know our daughter talks a lot about when you see dad go out every morning at 4:00 in the morning to get started with chores, or that every day you have to be home to take care of the cows, or when haying is going on, then everybody's helping with haying. I think that kind of, that you have to work hard, and the result is that if you're working hard, that things will hopefully go as well as you hope, has made a big impression on her.
And I think there's nobody easier to adapt to schedule changes than a farmer.
Yeah.
Because if you plot out your year on a farm, that's going to be on schedule for probably 2 days, and then it's all out the window.
That's right.
And to just be able to adapt to the ever-changing environment that you live in is really neat to see.
Yeah. And it requires a great deal of humility too, because farming is, it's humbling. You set out with goals, and weather and situations, take those away from you. But
the one comment I've heard a couple of times is farming is the one profession where you can do everything exactly as you should, and Mother Nature can still take it away from you.
Yeah.
And there is so much. It will teach you humility whether you like it or not.
Yeah. You realize how
we
little
rarely
control.
like it.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's true. The other thing that's been fun for us is to see our farm as a kind of a community identification place. We have a number of farms in our neighborhoods, but we also have a number of houses that are not farming. So the kids really would identify. If kids got locked out of the house when they got home from school and their parents were at work, we'll walk down to the farm. If something happened, go to the farm and they'll help you, because they knew that an adult would be home and somebody would be there to help. And there was a young woman who now is an adult, but when they used to come home from their vacations every year, as they come around the corner past the pastures, she'd roll down her window and say, "Hello, cows, I'm home." So just that kind of visual appreciation for this is a community we live in, and this is a place that we all identify is really powerful.
I think your history of it skipping a generation is really neat, because you didn't grow up on the farm learning from your parents or whatever, and then ended up taking over the family farm, which is a lot of people's entry into farming.
Yeah.
But to see that it skipped a generation, but so you really did the homework and everything to get onto the farm, it's a very unique story.
It is. And were you going to say something? I was just thinking that we're seeing now, we have a technical college that's a neighbor of our farm, and so they have kids, they have an agricultural program there, so the kids are there for 2, and some stay for 4 years, but mostly 2 years. A lot of them are people who have grown up on farms and are going back to their family farms. But for those who didn't, it's always this interesting challenge to say, okay, so you have a 19-year-old who probably shouldn't get their own farm and settle down at 19 and start farming. But how do we keep them engaged? What are the other training needs they need? How do we help them figure out a business plan and their financial needs, and how they're going to overcome this really significant obstacle of paying for a farm and it getting started? So I think that's a conversation that's happening a lot of places. But for people who don't necessarily have a farm operation to go to, how can we really help those kids get started and succeed because we've seen some big crashes.
Yeah, and let's face it, it's a family affair. You really have to, if it's a husband and wife going in together, you really have to have commitment of both people, and be dedicated as you go, because it's not easy. The schedule wise, you're very much in for maybe 80 hours a week or more of work, and it can be stressful on family life as well as being beneficial to family life. It can go either way for you. And so I think one of the things that was helpful for us is we did some planning ahead of time and said, okay, here's our goals. What do we want to do on this place, and what do we want to look like every year as we go forward? And that we wrote down some things, some values, and some goals and we tacked it on the refrigerator, and we kind of go back and reference that from time to time, saying, when I say, well, maybe I should buy this or that piece of equipment, he says, well, how does that help us meet these goals up here? And so occasionally I have to go back and humble myself and say, well, not really. So,
but shiny paint is really fun sometimes, isn't it?
Oh, yes. And but we have found that sometimes waiting and making sure you have the money first is makes it a lot makes it more realistic. So,
well, it's no different than any business, which is exactly what a small farm is a small business. But a small business, a lot of them have mission statements. Yeah. That's basically exactly what you did. And your day-to-day decision making was based around that mission statement of, hey, we want to reach this goal, and is this purchase or is this move going to really help me get there? And it helps you reassess everything. And without that overarching mission for any business, well, what's the point? You don't know what you're striving for, I guess is what I should say.
Yeah, which direction you're headed. Yeah, and I think it's easy to romanticize farms. I think you see it and you think, oh, they're outside in the sunshine with these beautiful animals who look like they just want to be with you all the time, and how lovely, what a wonderful life. And it's a wonderful life, full of significant sacrifice and challenges sometimes too. So I think, it's really hard for people to understand sometimes, what the impact of various family members are, but really having families who are capable of working together on farms is really essential to the success of a lot of farms.
Yeah, and what made me think of that is what a lot of times students coming out of college with a degree in agriculture they're not yet at the point of having a family figured out yet, and if you do go in, you want to make sure that your spouse is on board, has been part of writing that value statement, that mission statement. So,
because I think when you look at the small farm, now I'm talking 40, 50, 60 cows. While that is a small business and it should be run as a business, that is your life. Yeah. It's not, you are not locking the door to your store at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the evening and then you're done.
We're not closed on holidays.
Yes. And it is you have to want to have that life in order for a farm to be successful, I think.
Very much.
And to have, like you said, your wife or your partner, whatever, they really need to be on the same page, because this is a team effort to make it work. And it is not 40 hours. No. And it is not nice, long holiday weekends.
No. Yeah, and not even just to help with the physical work that needs to be done, which is a big part of it, but even being able to talk through, okay, this is the issue we have to figure out. Let's put our heads together and figure out what do we want to do here. Or just to have companionship when you're working. Sometimes, anything you do, if you're doing it with somebody else, is usually more fun than doing it by yourself. Yeah. Except for cutting hay. Brent likes to mow hay by himself.
Yes, that's where my heart sings.
But there's a lot of jobs. It's more fun to do things together. So I think figuring out what the strengths and preferences are of individual family members and how that all works together really is a big part of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it is kind of interesting, just kind of touching on that. You mentioned the kids coming out of school at 20 years old, 21 years old with a degree, thinking they want to get into farming, but they don't have the rest of their life the marriage side, the partner side figured out. So it is a big commitment to go in on their own. And one of the things that I see in working with the farmers that I work with is they'll hit this age, 18 to 24 years old, somewhere in there. And
the age of invincibility.
And a lot of them, and I'm going to reference farm kids. You got these farm kids that grew up on farms, and they hit 18 years old, and they say, I am never coming back to this place. Okay. And then all of a sudden at 24 years old, let's say they get married or they have a steady girlfriend, they realize, okay, I need to start making money here, and they go get a job and they start working somewhere else, and then they realize, that farm wasn't so bad.
Yeah. Yeah, the variety and being able to work for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the mindset starts changing even more, and then all of a sudden they want to move back or to the home farm or find a farm to farm themselves.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of interesting to watch that evolution. And I see some families that that I work with that I've talked to about their succession planning, and the cows won't be here once I'm done, because that's I don't have any kids that are interested. And then all of a sudden I just kind of tell them, well, just give it time. You're not done yet. You've got your time left, and just let your kids go through that cycle. Don't take what they're saying today at 18 years old. What I tell them is, if I was held to everything I said when I was 18 years old, I'd be in a lot of trouble right now.
I know. I hear that.
I think when I was 18, I could not think. I would never want to be on a farm. Well, 2 years later, I was back farming, because all of a sudden you realize, wow, it is. When you just stop thinking about all the fun times you're going to miss because you have to milk cows when you're 18,
Mm-hmm.
as you get older, you realize milking cows brings you home from places you'd rather not be.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Because, 3 o'clock, you're at a family reunion, and at 3 o'clock, I got to go home. I got to milk. I don't have that excuse anymore. That's actually my brother Tim uses that quite a bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
My cows bring me home from places I'd rather not be.
Now you've outed him.
Yeah, don't spill his secrets.
That's right.
He's not very secretive about it.
Yeah, I'd have to agree.
Well, is there anything else you would like to share about your farm, or
what you've learned along the way?
what you've learned? And
I think we've learned that there's a deep generosity in the communities where we live. We were talking earlier about how willing people are to share information, but I can certainly tell a number of times, too, when a tractor has gotten stuck in a field that needs to be pulled out by a bigger tractor at the neighbors, or something has happened where people very quickly gather around. So I think that's been a really important lesson.
Mm-hmm. And I think over the time that we've been farming on our own too, there's been a growing appreciation from the consumers. The people, the local eating movement very much affected our farm, because the local people reached out to us saying, "Oh, I see that you've got some, grain growing. We would love to have local flour. Could you mill that for us?" And that's given us a deep sense of satisfaction too. The milk that we produce is desired in the marketplace. We produce 100% grass-fed milk, and consumers are interested in purchasing that. Whereas as I mentioned, when we're growing up, the conventional market, they're trying to get farms to stop producing milk. Produce as little as you possibly can. Whereas now it's been a deep sense of satisfaction being able to have consumers reach out to us and want what we're producing, and that kind of has spurred us along. I think encouraged us.
Yeah, just thinking about the farmers that we've surrounded ourselves with over the years, and how, as a group, I don't think you'll find a better-natured, smarter, more patient group of people, because there's this realization that very little is under our control, but the things that we do have under our control are being able to give support to other people in your community too. So I'm not saying it very articulately, but I just have great admiration for the community of farmers and how little credit is given to a group that works very hard and in a way that has very little complaint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Well, on that note, that's the perfect ending right there.
I think so. Yep.
Thank you so much for sitting down with us today. I really enjoyed your story.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.